Hello and welcome to another edition of Catholics versus Buckeyes. That's our tongue-in-cheek title for the show where we talk everything Ohio State and Notre Dame football because we believe that these two schools are ready for the next era in college football, but they're also two of the biggest blue bloods, and that's why we wanted to have from Pick Six Previews, Brett Ciancia. Brett, thanks for joining us today. We want to talk all things blue bloods with you. You do a poll. It's very scientific. It's a Twitter poll every year where you basically just list each school that might be in the discussion, and you let the folks out there vote. Thanks for joining us, Brett.
Yeah, Seth and Brian, thanks for having me on. It's that time of year. It's the off season, so you see these debates going crazy about which schools are blue bloods. And the thing is, I polled over 100,000 people there on Twitter. You get 100,000 different responses of what a blue blood means to them. So it's a very variable definition. You can weigh the different categories more than others: national titles, all-time wins, Heisman winners, consensus All-Americans, draft picks. No matter how you cut it, Notre Dame and Ohio State are always towards the top of the list. Ohio State comes in there at 93% of fans think they're a blue blood. I assume the other 7% are Michigan fans. So, I mean, that's pretty much a unanimous blue blood. And then with Notre Dame there, they check in a third on the list at 83%. Still a healthy margin above that cutoff around 60%. So, these are two of the bluest bloods possible, no matter how you define the term, and excited to break it down with you guys.
Brian and I were talking yesterday, and it's almost like kind of like Major League Baseball's MVP vote, right? It's like we'll give you a few guidelines, but there's no set way. Everybody's opinion on what a blue blood is differs. What's your opinion, and we will get Brian's as well, of what makes a blue blood?
Well, yeah, a lot goes into it. I mean, I think you have to have those kind of metrics too: the wins, the national titles, the Heisman winners, all that stuff helps. But I think there's a couple keys. I think you have to be a dominant program over several generations. It's got to be part of the lifelong story of the sport. You can't really script college football story without that team or that program involved. And when you look at the 8 teams that continue to get picked in my poll every year, it's been 10 years straight. It's the same 10 teams every year. I think I might have to retire the poll. It's kind of proven its point where they're timeless. You have Ohio State and Michigan from the Big Ten, and Nebraska, formerly the Big 8, the Big 12, now the Big 10. Notre Dame there in the Midwest as well. You have USC as your West Coast powerhouse, Alabama as your Southern powerhouse, and then Oklahoma and Texas from the Midwest, the old Southwest Conference, the old Big 8. So those are the 8 that come out. People like to argue Nebraska starting to fall off the map there a little bit. If you look at the last 10, 15 years, they've really struggled. But I'd contend that a lot of these programs go through ebbs and flows. Oklahoma had a rough 90s decade. USC hasn't won a national title in 20 years. So each program has their pros and cons with it. But I think there's a solid 8 teams there. One team that catches my eye that I think kind of is a little bit different than this discussion is Florida State, because they are it's not by their own fault. It's just a younger school. Primarily, I think it was a teaching college, a women's college for a while, got football a lot later than these other blue bloods on the list. So they're missing those 1800s wins that Michigan has, and they're missing those 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. But when you look at their all-time win percentage, because it's a smaller sample size of years, they're up there. I mean, they had that incredible 80s and 90s run, 14 straight years of top 5 finishes. Of course, the 3 national titles. So Florida State stands out a little bit unique to me, that maybe they should be considered just because they lack those first 1800s years. But long story short, I think the program has to be central to the story of college football, had been dominant over several decades in coaches. And I think that all 8 fit that mold.
Yeah, and Brian, you and I talked about this yesterday. We were lining Brett up. You were kind of a mind, and I want you to explain it, that you really had to be more like prehistoric. You question even USC a little bit. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts, Brian, on what it means to be a blue blood.
Well, as an old-fashioned English major, I go back to the fact that the term was kind of coined in the literary canon about the old school aristocracy. And so, in that vein, I have a little bit in mind that your program was very involved in the formation and popularizing of college football. So, I'll probably, in my own personal view, go back a little bit farther. But I think that Brett and you, Seth, obviously brought up great points. I think continued excellence is very important. I really like Brett's point about multi-generational. I think that's also sort of why the term blue blood came into the modern lexicon in America as well. And I think there are a handful that are probably very easy to pick, and then we argue about three or four.
Yeah, Brett, I'm here in the Midwest in Columbus, Ohio. Brian is as well. So for me, I have a blind spot on Texas. Like, I know this is a poll. This isn't just what you believe, but tell me a little bit about why Texas would be a blue blood, and kind of fill in my blind spot a little bit. I know Darrell K. Royal, and I know the 50s and 60s were huge in that area, and so you point out really well parts of the country. But what do you think makes Texas a blue blood?
Yeah, well, this is one of those that I think if you break the blue bloods into two tiers, I think this is one of the questionable ones. I think they're not really a lock. They're not really one of those pure blue bloods like you find from Ohio State and Notre Dame. I think there's some debate here with Texas. You look at a 40-year, about a 30-year gap of national titles from 1970 to 2005. They were very competitive in the 2000s under Mac Brown. Maybe some of this goes back even further. Maybe it's some of that 50s, 60s talk. Texas being such a central state to the sport of football, with high school football, college football, maybe just being the flagship of that state in that area, maybe that carries some more weight. I'm not sure though. They usually are towards the bottom of that top 8 when we do the poll every year. I don't think it's all Oklahoma fans tampering. I think it's a legit question there for Texas. So yeah, that's fair. But what I like about Ohio State and Notre Dame, and I think that they're surefire picks for this one. They both came out of different ways. I mean, with Ohio State, it's a public school, it's a state school. They have over a century of history there. Ohio, talking about football states, Ohio's got to be up there. I mean, that's in the Mount Rushmore of football states, high school, college, pro, everything. So to be the flagship of that state, that region, all the continued success, 9 national titles, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, all those Heisman winners, and then continued into the modern era. That's the key, the multi-generational with Ohio State. The Woody Hayes era, but then continued into the 70s, 80s, 90s, the Tressel era, all the national titles that have followed since. There's never been a down period for Ohio State. That's what fascinates me with them. I can't find a decade where they were terrible, especially recently. And then just the impact on the game, the tradition, the pageantry, the rivalry with Michigan, the marching band. I was out in Ohio State 2 seasons ago. I could not believe how fascinating the band was. I got to see them do Script Ohio from field level there. Really cool. So Ohio State from the public side, definitely. Notre Dame is a little bit different coming from the private side of this, a Catholic school. They use those Catholic roots and connections throughout the country when they were popularizing their school, their brand, back in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. They'd go coast to coast. They still do. They play games out in California. They play the big ones in New York. Obviously, home games there outside of Chicago and South Bend. So really a national approach for Notre Dame, and connecting through their religion, their lineage that way. And also had a lot of connections in the media too with the Catholic brand. That got a lot of publicity, the 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way up. So those are. I was, when you asked me about Ohio State and Notre Dame, I was thinking they're both pure blue bloods at the top, but they have very different stories. So I was pretty fascinated by that.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I can ring in on Texas, I think what makes it difficult about Texas, because Brett's right, they had great runs in the 50s and 60s and then winning titles in the 70s. The problem is, especially for middle-aged folks like us, their blind spot just happens to coincide in the 80s and really the 90s until Ricky Williams showed up with a lot of yardage in the Heisman, is that sort of the dawn of the cable aspect of college football. They were just not a player at that point, and that's what makes them difficult. Is that the bracketing bookends of their history are wonderful, whether that be, like we said, 50s, 60s, 70s, and then basically in the new millennium they've been a player in the national scene. But that little gap they had was just that was the takeoff point for college football, in my view. It was the 80s and 90s, and they just weren't there. So that's what, to me, makes them a difficult case.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier about Florida State, and I understand what you're saying there. Miami, interestingly, came on a little earlier than Florida State, and they've got more titles and things like that. Brian and I were joking yesterday, there's no way Miami's a blue blood because they haven't done it long enough. But you think back now, we're closing in on 50 or so years since Howard Schnellenberger and company really took them onto the scene. What are your thoughts on Miami?
Yeah, well, I think with Miami, they're also a unique story. You look at, they have 5 national titles. They're over a 14-year span. So a decade and a half of pure dominance. They were the key storyline of the whole sport for 15 years. but really nothing since. I know that 2001, I'm sorry, I think it was 4 titles, and I have my numbers wrong, but it was 4 titles condensed, and then they had the 2001 title about 15 years later. And, that was a heck of a team. But since then, Ohio State took them down in 2002, and they have been off the map until this year's national title year. So I look at that as a solid decade plus, and then 25 years of nothing. So that's a little bit different. With Florida State, for me, I see that they had, the 80s and 90s were all dominant, top 5 finishes, a couple national titles there in 93 and 99. A little bit of down years. I mean, maybe like 5 to 10 years down, they come back, they win the 2013 national title, and then they rebrand themselves again. And I think should have been in the playoff in 2023, the undefeated season. So with Florida State, it seems like they keep coming back every 5-10 years. They keep, rounding into a national powerhouse. So that's why I was doing them slightly different. But now with Miami making a turn back with Mario Cristobal, incredible coaching job, incredible turnaround, I think they're well positioned in this new ACC without the Dabo dynasty, with that receding a little bit. I think Miami can start to collect ACC titles and playoff appearances and maybe some national titles. So Miami's story is, along with Florida State, they're not done yet. I think they're younger programs, and I think they're going to continue to cash in on national titles. So they're in like a different category. And to Brian's point about the old lineage, the old term of blue blood, maybe it's impossible for them to join because they just weren't there in the 50s and before then. So maybe it's just a different kind of category to talk about.
Hey, you mentioned Ohio State and Notre Dame kind of coming at it different ways. I view the sport as being very regional up until the BCS, and then it became more of a national discussion. What do you think, especially the way you've seen them handle things these last few years, what do you think about Ohio State and Notre Dame's chances going forward of kind of maintaining this status and really being, swimming at the top of this poll every year? I mean, Alabama's still there, right there with them, but we know Alabama looks a little different than they did a few years ago.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to it. I think one of the keys is, does the fan base and the alumni have an appetite for it? Because it's going to be a very costly enterprise going forward, building up a national title roster every year and continuing to be a powerhouse. Ohio State certainly has it. That's never going to go away. I mean, like I said, I got to see that live 2 years ago, but just from Twitter, you look at TV ratings, Columbus and the state of Ohio is always at the top of the TV markets. And, I'm not a TV exec. It doesn't really matter too much to me, but that's a good inference point to see that there is fan passion all over the state for college football. So I don't see Ohio State going anywhere. I think they're well positioned going forward. They're going to continue to be an ace recruiter. Again, a top 5 class was signed yesterday on signing day. So they're not going anywhere. With Notre Dame, they had some ebbs and flows during my younger years, the 2000s, the Charlie Weiss era, the Willingham era. Some down years there, but Brian Kelly got them back into the national title game and discussion every year. And then now I think the difference is with Marcus Freeman, he's unlocked a new tier of recruiting, it looks like. So when I was growing up and starting Pick Six previews, they were never a top 5 recruiter, rarely top 10, but now with Marcus Freeman, they're always in there. So that's one of the keys is recruiting too. So fan passion with Ohio State, and then recruiting on both sides, but Notre Dame unlocking that new level of recruiting. I see them both continuing far into the playoff era as Blue Bloods.
Brian,
I'll be curious to see how the younger generation reacts to Notre Dame, because being a blue blood, it's like people our generation and older, like our parents, sort of revere Notre Dame, and everybody has a reaction to them who's an older football fan, in my view, whether good, bad, or in the middle. And the question for them becomes, and this is sort of beating a dead horse, but are they going to join a conference? Because I think the challenge for them will be having compelling regular season games. Because if you're not in a conference, you're struggling to play Rice and Air Force and Purdue, because Michigan and USC are in this loaded Big Ten, and they're going to drop you essentially. And so for them, I think that's their biggest challenge going forward. I think they'll always have alumni. They'll always have money. It's just a matter of on the national consciousness. I think they'll make the playoff more often than not, which maybe that in and of itself will keep them in the blue blood stratosphere. But I do think it will be hard if people care less and less about their regular season games, because to a lot of folks, they're not going to mean a lot if it's not against high level competition as much, and it doesn't result in an automatic bid via conference championship.
Yeah, that's potentially true. I mean, when you talk about the money side of this too, is that these conference TV deals are so big. I mean, you see the Big Ten's now the new leader in revenue from TV. That funnels into coaching staff, recruiting, facilities, everything. So I think 10, 20 years ago, Notre Dame had the best deal with NBC, but I think the conferences have catched up and now surpassed them. So in such a financial arms race going forward, is that going to keep them down? We'll see. So far, so good for Notre Dame. They're having some of their best seasons in a long time. But I do wonder, to your point about the younger generation, they've never seen Notre Dame as a national champion or being the team, the powerhouse, even for a few years span. So talking about title droughts, 1987 for them. So that's longer than Nebraska, longer than Texas, longer than USC, the other teams in question, longer than Penn State even, or I guess equal to Penn State. They were 86. So all those teams on the bubble, that national title lag is starting to kick in. But no, I think that the independence is actually central to Notre Dame's history, though. I mean, we talked about it. That's what made them so unique. So in a weird way, I kind of hope they retain that with the sport that's losing so much tradition. I like Notre Dame being independent and picking their schedule. And I know, like to your point, that might be harder going forward. But I love that. I love the Rose Bowl, keeping up their standards. I want to keep as much tradition as possible because over the last 10, 20 years, we've lost so much.
Mm-hmm. Hey, one more thing, and then I want you to tell people what you're doing at Pick Six Previews. But the last question I have, you look at Nebraska. They were at 67% this year. Can a blue blood fall off? And then tell us all about Pick Six Previews.
Well, if there's ever a case, it might be Nebraska. They're really struggling here. And, so a quick look at their history. They were dominant for decades. Bob Devaney took them to the national stage in the 60s and 70s, won back-to-back titles there, 70 and 71, handed the keys over to Tom Osborne. That started a 25-year era of just always 9+ wins, which back then, 9 wins was you were 9-1, 9-2. It's a lot watered down now, but 9 wins every year. And then the 3 big national titles to cap off a great career, 94, 95, 97. So 5 national titles over multiple decades. And that coincided with that TV boom, to Brian's point. That was the cable era. So everyone at 3:30, whatever, on the East Coast, you're seeing Nebraska play a Big 8 team or in Oklahoma, obviously. So they have all the old-time history. But since then, they've really struggled. 1 national title appearance, and that was 2001. Since then, nothing. I mean, they've tried to rebrand themselves as a West Coast passing attack under Callahan. That failed. Then they went defense first with Pelini. That actually was a pretty successful era. I mean, he was getting them turned around. He had a couple 10-win seasons, fired him, and then it's been even worse. I think that's when you fired Bo Pelini, that's where it really fell off, because you're talking Mike Riley, Scott Frost, even Matt Rule has not done much so far. So, and here's the thing with Nebraska. The one thing you can't change about a school is its geography. And they have a 500-mile radius around their campus where it's just there's no high school talent around. You look at Ohio State, you have the state of Ohio. You look at Alabama, they have the whole SEC map down there. You look at California, USC, Texas obviously speaks for itself. But with Nebraska, they don't have that homegrown pipeline of talent coming in every year. That's a no-brainer. You know you're going to sign the best 10 kids from the state. It just doesn't equate to these other programs. So they're really struggling. I think they need to find a new avenue or something. But to your point, can a team fall off? I don't know. I've been doing the poll for 10 years and they've consistently ranked in that top 8. So I don't know if it's even possible. Maybe they're just these blue bloods locked in for life. So I don't know. It's a good discussion. We'll see every year, but it stayed the same. They're always in there. They vote well. Their fans care. I think that's going to keep them afloat, or at least, their sellout streak, all their fan base. So that's where we're at with Nebraska. We'll see.
All right. Hey, Pick Six Previews, you mentioned coming out, more toward July. You preview every school. You've always done great with college football playoff predictions as well. Tell people where they can find you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I appreciate it. Pick Six Preview is a college football magazine that I produce. It's a one-man show. I do all 68 Power 4 teams. I have all my advanced stats on the side of the page, but put it back into readable terms. Sometimes these magazines and sources are too, computer codey with acronyms and weird formulas. I break it down for you. I try and put it in readable terms. I'm interviewing head coaches, coordinators, looking at spring games, everything I can get my hands on. So very comprehensive preview magazine coming out every July. You can find it at pick6previews.com and at pick6previews on Twitter. And then new last year, what I launched was called Pick 6 Plus. And what that is, it's basically the magazine every Tuesday during the season. So it's refreshed with new stats, new picks, new predictions, all my formula picks. So that's called Pick 6 Plus. And it had a great debut last year. We're running it back again for 2026.
Brett Ciancia, thanks so much for taking the time. I told you 10 to 15 minutes, and we're almost at 20. I really
I can do
appreciate
an
it.
hour on this stuff. I love it. It's
I love it.
February, not much to talk about, but yeah, I can do an hour. You know that.
Awesome stuff. Brett, we look forward to talking to you maybe again in the summer to preview the season. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Brett.
All right, back here with you on Catholics versus Buckeyes. So awesome to talk to Brett Ciancia. Brian, that was a good conversation.
Yeah, what a great reference. I've followed him for years and just so comprehensive, but like he said, in readable terms.
Yeah, so no doubt, no doubt. Well, let's talk a little bit. We've got a topic today, and look, we're already 20 minutes in. This might go a little long. I was preparing this topic before we got Brett to join us. So let's just talk about a little bit, maybe close games for both Ohio State and Notre Dame. Okay, so I'm just trying to get a read on the coaches and how they react, and we will be fair. Ohio State has won some big games and by a comfortable margin. 2020 against Clemson comes to mind, blowing out good teams. And honestly, if you look at the Ryan Day versus James Franklin era, the Penn State game was always so big, but you look at it and Ryan Day won by double digits multiple times. But is there something before we dive in, is there something we can learn about the close losses, the close games?
Well, I think honestly that is more of an in-game coaching scenario.
Yeah.
You can really dive into the play calling, the approach, the philosophy of a particular coach, because you have to remember football is the most choreographed sport we have, i.e., there's room for freelancing after the play starts, but you have to line up essentially where the coach or the coordinator wants you to line up, and then you must run the play as decided by them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, their decisions are foremost in what's happening on a down to down basis. And so, you can have all the talent on earth. If you're calling the wrong plays over and over again, you're going to have a problem. So I
So,
think in close
yeah.
games, in-game decision making by coaches is paramount.
So again, I want to be fair to Ryan Day. He's 82-12, so that's an 872 winning percentage. And again, I talked with Tim Daniel last week. Both coaches, Ryan Day and Marcus Freeman, that we talk about, they were not head coaches before, so that's kind of they're rare air there because of taking over blue blood programs, having never coached before. It's kind of interesting that both schools are in that situation. All right, 2019, they go 13-1. They lose a game you and I don't want to talk about anymore. We have spent, long before this podcast existed, we spent hours on the phone talking about this game. Ohio State led that game 16-0, and they just ultimately didn't score enough touchdowns. They lose 29-23, and the game ends on an interception where Chris Olave famously broke off his route. Probably the reason Chris Olave came back for 2020, to be honest with you. Again, there were 10 things you and I counted out, and I don't want to go back over them all now. There were 10 things in that game that if they happened just the other way, any one of them, Ohio State wins the game. So I guess your thoughts overall on that game certainly comes down to a 6-point loss.
When Shaun Wade was in the game for Ohio State, Clemson didn't score a point. That's kind of where I leave it. Most football fans you and I have spoken to think targeting is the single worst rule in all of sports. Trevor Lawrence got up and played like the next play. And then you contrast that, which we'll talk about with the Georgia loss, where Javon Bullard knocked Marvin Harrison literally unconscious. And he couldn't play the rest of the game, and that was not a flag.
That's right.
So, again, it's just you ran into at the worst possible moment, the worst possible rule in sports. And then that started a cascade of, you're right, you could have rebounded and made any one of 7 or 8 plays that would have changed the course of the game. But to be honest with you, when Shaun Wade was in the game, it was fixing to be a blowout.
And yeah, what was it? Justin Ross caught the ball. He had it extended with one arm, and he took 3 full steps with it. It's a fumble picked up by Jordan Fuller for a touchdown, and they rule a incomplete pass. That game was rife with issues that probably.
Let me interject one thing, Seth. And I didn't do enough research to make sure this is absolutely 100% true. But I did see where a lot of those were SEC officials who were also involved in that controversial game between Auburn and Georgia this year. And I think some of them got fired.
Yeah, no, the whole crew. The whole crew got let go.
So you're also dealing possibly with incompetent people.
unbelievable situation there. And certainly now there were a few times where they settled for field goals that maybe Ryan Day could have made a different coaching decision. But that game is more, I think, of a fluke nature. And I guess we'll go there. 2020, they only lost the national title game. It was a big loss to Alabama. Certainly there are some things where they used the Big Ten COVID rules going into that game, and Alabama had basically no rules because the SEC didn't have the same structure. But yeah, Trey Sermon breaks his collarbone, I think, on the first play of the game, his first carry. There was so much wrong in that game, and it was a Death Star of a team. So we'll skip over that. Of course, that was the revenge game in the semifinal. They beat Clemson 49-28. 2021. This one's tough because C.J. Stroud's a first-year starter. He did not throw a single pass the year before, which maybe that goes to coaching as well. Perhaps you need to get your nearly a 5-star quarterback that you think is going to be your guy the next year a few reps. He throws an interception in the Oregon game, which I think was week 2. That was tough because he threw for a lot of yards, C.J. Stroud, that game, but he had to throw 54 passes as they played kind of come from behind the whole time. A lot of people think Julian Sayin this past year, Ryan Day learned from how he handled C.J. Stroud. And remember, famously against Texas, and even nearly going on their first big road trip to Washington, Sayin wasn't asked to do as much. Your thoughts on that Oregon game? Mario Cristobal was the coach of that team.
Indeed. A couple things come to mind. Number one, they kind of turned over the roster from that team in 19 and 20 that was knocking on the door of the national title. So there was going to be a little bit of a bumpy road that we all understood. And I think what coalesced together in that game, it was more disappointing because it was at home, obviously. But what came together was the fact that you had a relatively green new starter at quarterback who made a few mistakes. And number two, that was the beginning of the end for that era Ohio State defense, where Oregon just kept running the same play, this little stretch play to the boundary with that mobile quarterback, and like Ohio State's linebackers were nowhere to be found. That was kind of the beginning of the end for the Kerry Combs era. Obviously, it manifested itself in a game we'll talk about later in Ann Arbor, but I think absolutely the beginning of the end for that group of defensive folks, shall we say, mixed with a new starter having an uneven game at quarterback.
So famously, they beat Utah in the Rose Bowl, a non-playoff game. It was a track meet, 48-45. Utah's playing offensive players at defensive back. C.J. Stroud shredded them, but it's a rare one-score victory for Ryan Day because honestly, again, they blow out most of their opponents by 10 or more points. They did pull that one off, so you give credit there. In 2022, they win the opener against Marcus Freeman. That's his first season. He had coached in the bowl game. We'll talk more about that when we talk Notre Dame. But he wins that game 21-10. And famously, as you mentioned, and we're not talking about the blowout losses to Michigan. This is all close games we want to talk about. Famously, the Georgia game. It's a playoff game. They have the game kind of not wrapped up, but you could definitely make the argument if Marvin Harrison doesn't get knocked out. Because it wasn't just Marvin Harrison. He was playing with – C.J. Stroud was playing with backup receivers and tight ends everywhere. Guys were hurt. Cade Stover went out in that game. Not having Marvin Harrison changed everything. Now, talking about coaching, Brian, that's famously the game where Ryan Day kind of unleashed, a lot of people call it Death Star Ryan Day or whatever. Like, he came out really wanting to click on all cylinders, and he gets a lot of credit for that game, even in a loss.
He does, but in hindsight, for the more selective viewer, you then think about how he managed the last possession. And then it comes down to, is that tight Ryan Day at the end? Because if you recall, they needed to drive down at the end behind by, I believe, 2 points, where a field goal would win the game. And they actually got a couple of first downs, got to the Georgia half of the yard, and then he couldn't figure out. We'd have to go down by down, but the last series of downs, he couldn't figure out what he wanted to do. Did he really want to throw the ball? Did he really want to run the ball? He kind of threw a weird pass to a tight end over the middle, and then they essentially settled for a 55-yard field goal that never had a chance. Well, so it was kind of like, you're right, he was Death Star Ryan Day up until the 2 or 3 plays that really, 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 really you had to have.
Yeah, and up until this year, the Miami loss, when he's had more than a week to prepare for teams, that's when he's really made hay. So that is interesting that when he can kind of get everything locked in and ready to go, he's super successful. Watch that 2024 playoff run. But when he had to kind of everything needed to slow down for him, maybe he was sped up as a coach. And famously, too, CJ Stroud had some runs in that game that he didn't make prior to that, really. So that was interesting as well. Now, 2023, week 4, the two programs we talk about converge. Ohio State at Notre Dame. Kyle McCord, the one-year starter for Ohio State. He orchestrated an amazing comeback. This is the one game where Ohio State under Ryan Day has really come down the field and made and scored when they have to score to win a game. I remember the nice pickup by Emeka Buka. Famously in that game, Marvin Harrison, he was blocking out in front, I believe, of Travion Henderson's long run, and he got doubled up and he got kind of hurt in that game, so he wasn't effective anymore. And Emeka Buka made the big catch, and I think Chip Trainum scored the winning touchdown against. We talk about coaching. Maybe they only had 10 players out on the field, Notre Dame. So interestingly, there the two coaches came against each other, and Ryan Day was able to come out victorious.
Yeah, absolutely. That was kind of the opposite of the Georgia game, where I felt like my recall is that Ohio State kind of had a pillow fight for most of the game. They really didn't get a lot done on offense with, again, a first-year starter, as we've seen happens at quarterback. But, they had a Buka and Harrison and Henderson. They really couldn't get a lot happening throughout big portions of that game. But unlike Georgia, when they had to have the plays on that drive at the end, Ryan Day manufactured some very nice play calls and successful first downs were had. I mean, that square in throw to Emeka Buka to like the 3 or 4 was probably one of the best throws of Kyle McCord's life.
Yes.
I mean, in
Well,
between
he's more
coverage, an absolute 20-yard rope to a player who's, up for Rookie of the Year in the NFL now.
He was a gunslinger, all through and through, and they moved on from him because in the Michigan game that year, he throws a soul-crushing interception early in the game, sets up a touchdown, and then they lose the game 30-24. Famously, when he had Marvin Harrison open on what looked like they were going to march right down the field again. And honestly, like as fans, you watch these games, and because they had done it against Notre Dame, I had a little more hope, I think, than I would have normally in that game. And certainly the middle of the line was completely destroyed on that play, and McCord was hit as he threw it, and he underthrew it. So, yeah, that's the converse of what could happen if you rely on your gunslinger to get you down the field is he throws that interception.
Yeah, the Michigan game obviously was a nip and tuck affair to a Michigan team that obviously was the national champion that year. And indeed, you got the sense that Ohio State getting the ball at the very end. And again, same thing as Georgia. They got a few quick first downs and then found themselves in Michigan territory and obviously became different. And to be honest with you, that last play, the interception, Harrison was breaking open at about the 15 or 20-yard line, is my memory. And the quarterback just got hit enough. It wasn't like the ball went straight up in the air. He just kind of got nudged in his throwing motion in a perfect moment where you almost look back on it and think when a team wins a national title, they have a few plays that just go their way.
Right.
For whatever reason. And from the Michigan perspective, that was just one of them.
Yeah, we could talk.
I forget who it was, but just nudged McCord enough to change the trajectory of his hands. And when you win a title, you got to have some of those plays, and Michigan had it that day.
We could talk 1997 Michigan, Ohio State as well for plays like that. 2024 saw them lose the Oregon game. Remember, they had that key offensive pass interference call go against Jeremiah Smith. They were already in field goal range if that catch counts. And certainly Will Howard famously slid down with no time to get the timeout or get back up and get set up. Certainly, again, we could question clock management there. All right. I'm gonna lump that one in with the Michigan game a little bit, although they were more free flowing in the Oregon game. They lose to Michigan at home, 13-10, and you just everything. That's the famous one where that had the players only Coach Day in the room, and the rest of it all players. They're screaming at him. Mitchell Melton famously got off a few barbs, hit Ryan Day in that game, found himself playing somewhere else the next year. But that game typified it as well, right? I mean, 13-10 to a team without a quarterback, basically.
Yeah, and that came down to the Ryan Day lost in his own head with his
Mhm.
mentor Chip
Got to
Kelly,
win the
deciding
rushing title. Yep.
they're gonna out muscle Michigan in the middle of the yard when all of their advantage is on the outside. It's just like, if you're gonna lose playing what you do. I mean, in full disclosure, I wanted Ryan Day fired
Hmm.
after that game when he
Yeah.
just sat there, as Rome burned and Jack Sawyer wanted to fight everybody. He just sat there and did nothing.
Yes.
Now, in hindsight, I was wrong, but in the moment, that was the apex of what on earth is Ryan Day doing in terms of getting lost in his own mind instead of just being a normal football coach, calling the plays that you're good at, and just living to fight another day. It seemed like he was caught in winning some bizarre emotional matchup with Michigan and Sharon Moore about how we're going to win,
Yeah.
which I think to most people is preposterous. Who cares? Just
Well, and
win.
certainly we thought because they went on to win the national title, they went on that great run, secured his job,
Sure.
Buckeye lore, all that. We thought maybe he'd turned a corner there, and then this year he played with 3 and 4 tight ends so many times that he took his best 2 players off the field. We'll get we'll get to that in a minute. They win the national title game, though. We touch on that. Notre Dame, they win by 11 points, but they were blowing the Irish out. And if you remember, certainly the pass to Jeremiah Smith on third down sealed it. They kicked the field goal to go up by 11. That game was over. That game he played well, but again, they had the big lead earlier. So let's not dwell on that one. Let's go ahead and go to 2025. Season started 12-0, right? Cruise control after that Texas win. He got a lot of credit for handling Stroud the way he did. The only one, what was it, 14-7, I think? Was that the score? They give up a late score to Arch Manning, but Arch Manning was seeing ghosts the whole game. Pretty much the way you want to draw up a win against a presumptive #1 team in the country, but then they lose their last 2 games. They lose to Indiana in the Big Ten title game. They had 2 drives, Brian, in the second half that totaled over 15 minutes, by which they got 0 points. And we point to the coaching yet again. And again, there's only a few of these close games. They've only gotten blown out a few times, and they were, a lot of those were those Michigan games. What do you think about the second half against Indiana and how that they lose 13-10? The fate of both teams could have changed that night.
It absolutely could. I felt like watching that game. Ohio State was better than Indiana, and I agree. You shouldn't say it, but I think a couple of Ohio State players have intimated that, we play 10 times, we win 7. I 100% agree. But nevertheless, again, I thought the mentality of the two coaches was in stark difference,
Mm-hmm.
where Kurt Signetti just decided that on big money downs, Mendoza's going to throw the ball down the yard, and Ohio State just did not. Ryan Day can get obsessed without scheming somebody. And you can tell when they call those shot plays. You and I have discussed this on and off the podcast. When you know when it's coming, it's that play action. You see Julian Sands' number is back for a minute. They have coached him, in my view, at least from what I've watched, that if that play is not wide open, don't throw it. And I think the fundamental difference between Kurt Signetti in that game and Ryan Day is that Kurt Signetti taught his player, when I call that play, you throw the ball. And it's
Mm-hmm.
up then to my receiver to catch it. And for whatever reason, Ryan Day, I think, gets lost in fear. I really do. Where of what's going to go wrong when it's just like, listen, if there's 3 guys on Jeremiah Smith, just throw the ball anyway. Who cares?
When they
But
brought
I
Arthur
think,
Smith in to be the
and
new offensive coordinator, he's got to take a moment this offseason and say, why did we do it this way? I wasn't here. We're not going to do this way anymore. There needs to be some reflection because we don't know for sure. Do we blame Julian Sand? He got run up on a little bit in the UCLA game, injured the ankle. Before then, he was more turning it loose. He's not a running quarterback by any means. But at that point, you think, oh my goodness, he's not turning it loose and he's not finding these guys down the field. I had a coach. I was in high school basketball freshman year. All right. I'm playing freshman ball. I was a backup most of the season. I ended up starting the second half of the season. But we were running a play in practice where there's multiple cutters. A guy's got the ball in the wing in triple threat position. Multiple cutters come through. I flash through wide open. He doesn't pass me the ball. Now I become very embarrassed by what happens next because coach blows his whistle, comes in and screams at the kid who didn't pass me the ball and says, I drew up the play. He's open. You pass it to him. I don't care what happens then. Let me deal with whether Seth can make the shot or not. He's open. The play's made to do that. Pass on the ball. Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate can go up with anybody, get the ball. They're even when they're not wide open, throw the ball. I like your point. I think it fits in well. Is it a coaching thing? Is it a Julian saying got in his head thing? We have to wait till next season to find out. But the Miami game, Brian, is the same thing. 10-point loss, but it's 17-14 late. They get a first down. Looks like with about 7 minutes to go or so, they're going to just go down the field and score, and we're going to have a great finish to this game. And they turn it over. They have to punt. They didn't turn it over. They end up having to punt, and then they give up gashing plays down the field. They have to give up the touchdown. This is another case, Brian, where they just didn't go down and get the ball down the field.
Well, and moreover, it makes those of us of a certain vintage, i.e., 40 years old plus, we think back to John Cooper.
Yeah.
Because, the bottom line is that Ryan Day is 0-2 in 3 of the last 4 seasons. And that was like the John Cooper mantra. He won every other game except the last 2. And more often than not, Coop would lose those games because the offense got bogged down and they played a little scaredy cat football where they were going off tackle all day. And I got to tell you, I think that happens to Ryan Day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, with that offense, you're telling me in the last 2 games they combined for 23 points?
Yep.
Not even?
No, it was 10 points in the one and then 14 in the other. So 24.
Okay, 24 points.
Per 2
games. You could have some 7-year-old down your street calling plays on PlayStation. I don't even know if that's the right game console reference, but nevertheless. And I feel like you could score more points. I'm just sorry. That's, you're making $12 million a year. I have every right to criticize you for that.
All right.
Just grow up. Throw the ball down the yard. Because I think the problem when I've talked to you, when I've talked to some of my dear friends, when I've talked to even average Ohio State or sports fans, we watch sports because it's aggressive, because it's like the part of life where you go for it and you just leave everything on the field, put all your chips on the table. People do not like scaredy cat football. And I feel like I'm sorry to use a juvenile term, but I just think that's the disappointment. If you throw the ball 50 times and you throw 6 picks, you shake their hand to go home. But this idea that I just think they get super tight in big games. And I honestly think, again, outside of that glorious run in 2024, which credit where credit's due, I think Ryan Day's turning into John Cooper, and I need to be proven wrong.
Ooh, that's a little scary. All right,
That's
before we
where
go,
I am. Those are the results.
It's fair. It's fair. Before we move on to Notre Dame, let's talk about it. Ryan Day again, 82-12 overall, had that amazing run, beat Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, Notre Dame, then started the next season by beating Texas. I don't know if there's going to be a run completely like that again, although we see certainly Indiana's going to make a run for their money on that because of beating Ohio State and then winning the whole thing. I mentioned the Notre Dame game in 23. He also, saw his team break a tie in that Rose Bowl game against Utah. Fewer stakes. It's not a playoff game. Players that caught TDs in that game: Marvin Harrison Jr., Jackson Smith and Jigba, Dalton Kincaid for Utah. So some NFL players. You said it great. We don't need to add much more about Ryan Day. You hope he'll come out of it. You hope some of the hires, some of the moves, a more experienced quarterback next year, perhaps things will change a little bit. And again, be fair. He's got a national championship. He's 82-12. I'm not ready to string him up, obviously, but I think it's fair to criticize. So we'll be back after just another break here to talk about Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame. All right, welcome back. Certainly, we broke down Ryan Day and what he's done. Again, just kind of strange. 2 of the bluest blue bloods in the country, both hired head coaches without prior experience doing that job. Marcus Freeman, not quite as prolific as Ryan Day in his shorter career, 38-10, a 792 winning percentage. Part of the narrative, though, with him is he's lost some inexplicable games along the way, right? I mean, certainly we'll talk about them here in a minute, but that's kind of out there on Marcus Freeman. We both agree on that, right?
Yeah, and a lot of it was getting his sea legs early, but I mean, losing to a MAC team, there's just you shouldn't even be in a close game at the end. I think that's more the criticism than anything else. And losing to Marshall is sort of the equivalent. And it's just one of those things where you combine a young coach who's never had the reins, who's kind of assembling his roster, and then learning how to manage that game, but also learning to turn his talent loose.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So yeah, he took over for that Fiesta Bowl. I'm not going to hold that one against him. They lose 37-35 to
Of course
Oklahoma
not.
State. Both teams are ranked in the top 10. Okay, so let's call him the first-year head coach the next year. One of the reasons we talk about that is, again, he'd never been a head coach before. He lost his first 2 regular season games. He lost the game at Ohio State, which is, let's remind people, that's his alma mater. All right, so his first real test was against his alma mater. They lose 21-10. Then he comes home.
And to be honest with you, Seth, if I may interject, they had a good showing. I was in the stadium that day.
Yeah, I was
felt
too.
like Notre Dame was very prepared, and they handled the crowd noise.
Mm-hmm.
They handled, the specter of a head coach returning to his roots and playing against his old school. I thought they handled the thing well. They just didn't have enough players at that point, in my view.
Yeah, Jackson Smith and Jigba, who that affects C.J. Stroud's overall numbers that year. He got hurt in that game, so that maybe had a little bit to do with it. But yes, certainly they did. They lost at home to Marshall 26-21 the next week. But that's deceiving, Brian, because they scored a TD with 14 seconds left, so they were not in that game. And that's the one you just can't lose. We'll be talking about 2025 in a minute. They didn't lose that game this past year, but it was the other games that hurt them. They also lost 16-14 to Stanford, also at home. That's a tough one. And they also went on to lose 38-27 at USC later that season. Stanford kicked a field goal to go up 16-14, Brian. If I tell you that, you think, oh, man, heartbreak. There was 10 minutes and 20 seconds left on the clock, Brian. They should have had ample chances. That's the kind of game you just can't lose.
Well, the interesting point about that vis-a-vis Marcus Freeman is that those 3 losses were on brand for him because their defense kept them in the game.
Right.
Played well, but he just wasn't to a point where, he could kind of overrule his offensive coordinator and what they were doing on offense, which was not much, even though I believe they had Sam Hartman, who was relatively well thought of as a quarterback, but they just could not get enough offense going, which is the opposite of Ryan Day, because Ryan Day is going 0-2 at the end of seasons because his offense isn't performing, even though he's an offensive guy. So at least with Freeman, looking back, you got the sense that he was building the program the way he understood football, which is we play defense first. The problem is he absorbed bad losses because they just couldn't score a touchdown a quarter against bad teams.
Yeah, they were a little handcuffed on offense too because Lorenzo Styles Jr. was the starting receiver on that team. He had the biggest catch of the game against Ohio State that year. For reference, he just finished a senior year where he started at nickel defensive back for Ohio State. He came home, and after he transferred, he switched positions. So that they were a little handcuffed. But hey, you're the head coach. You've got to recruit as well. Going to 2023, they lose that close game to Ohio State. Want to mention again, they line up with only 10 players on the touchdown. That's tough, right? That's coaching. You mentioned, players have to do what the coach tells them. Somebody on the staff didn't send enough players out there, or somebody wasn't ready. That's a tough look at home, even if it's against an Ohio State team.
Yeah, that's a brutal ending, and it's sort of laid bare for all the viewers to see that they were terribly disorganized from the adults in the room, not figuring out who needs to be in the game and when. Which again, though, it kind of underscored the fact that, as we've talked about with Marcus Freeman being a former linebacker, their defense played brilliantly most of the game.
Mm-hmm.
They kept an Ohio State team that had the Biletnikoff Award winner eventually, Marvin Harrison, under wraps for most of the game and got it to where they took the lead late and just couldn't hold on. But yeah, it's very glaring when at the end you just have such almost an administrative gaffe.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned defense multiple times here. Let's be fair. They lost to Louisville 33-20. So they gave up points there. You go back to that USC loss the year before they lost. They gave up 38 points. They lost at Clemson 31-23. Again, they score with 6:05 to go to cut it to 8. Nobody scores the rest of the way. They win the rest of their games that year by double digits. So the defense is their calling card, but their losses, except for the Ohio State games, kind of went the other way. Now 2024, that's the one we talk about. Northern Illinois, the MAC school comes in. They lose 16-14 at home. Boy, that had people question. We're talking about 2024. They would eventually play for a national title in that season. But right then and there, there were some people talking about Marcus Freeman, weren't there?
Absolutely, and rightfully so. You lose an opener like that to a MAC school at home, they're going to want you out. But in hindsight, that might have been the best thing that happened to them because it galvanized the players and the staff of, hey, man, we're on thin ice here. We just got to ball out from here on out. And, obviously they didn't lose again until they lost the national championship game to Ohio State. And along the way, they beat in the playoff Indiana and Turk Signetti, which that's their last loss. Was in that game that Marcus Freeman and the boys handled them pretty solidly. Riley Leonard and Jaden Greathouse performing.
Both teams very fortunate that it's a 12-team playoff. It's the first 12-team playoff.
Sure.
The committee held the Northern Illinois loss kind of above their heads the rest of the year, probably justifiably. And if it was a 4-team playoff, I don't think, certainly Ohio State doesn't get in with 2 losses. And so I don't think Notre Dame would have gotten in either. So they both get in the first year of the 12-team playoff and show how good they are. Now, 2025, they lose their first 2 contests. And seemingly, though, throughout the year with the playoff committees made for TV, thing every week, they were seemingly in the good graces of the playoff committee again, back in the fold. Then they get held out. We've spoken on this before in this show. Alabama shouldn't have gotten in. Notre Dame should have, in our opinions. Maybe even Miami, even though they showed they deserved to be there with their run. First year starting quarterback, CJ Carr. They were down 21-7 to Miami. And all of a sudden, you've seen this before, young quarterback, take all the burden off his shoulders and just let him run 2-minute offense. He showed why he's at the level of a recruit he was. He brings them back to tie it 24-24, but they lose the game at the end.
Yeah, and again, they lost to 2 playoff teams. I'll be on record till I'm in the ground that it should have been Notre Dame. ESPN's painfully corrupt in a lot of issues. We all know that. That's obvious now. But nevertheless, from your perspective of personal responsibility, man, you can't lose your first 2 games. I don't care if it's against the Patriots and the Seahawks. You go 0-2 to start a college football season, you're kind of sunk.
Sure.
And again, that the bad luck of scheduling years in advance, Miami and Texas A&M, who are good programs, but they had their best seasons the same year.
Yeah.
And obviously we can talk about the holding call on the 4th down against Texas A&M, and that's all well and good. But the bottom line was I thought Notre Dame acquitted themselves well in those games, but you can't go 0-2.
Yeah, so the year before, they actually won in College Station 23-13. That was probably one of Freeman's best wins before his playoff run. That was something else. And then this past year, A&M outlasted them 41-40. You mentioned the infamous holding call. Jeremiah Love scored with 2:53 to go. Again, we're talking about defense with Marcus Freeman.
Yeah.
They went up 40-34. It's a barn burner. And defensive coordinator Chris Ash, boy, he's still kind of not getting Christmas cards from Notre Dame fans at this point because they're very suspicious of him as the defensive play caller. They couldn't hang on. 13 seconds ago, Marcel Reed finds Nate Burkircher, and Aggies score, and like you said, have one of their best years. Now, maybe this is telling. Let's think about that schedule. Every other game the rest of the year is a double-digit or far, like a huge win for Notre Dame. They beat then 23rd ranked Pitt 37-15, and then 20th ranked USC 34-24. But the schedule overall, it does them no favors. And to your point with Brett earlier, they're going to have a harder time scheduling these teams later in the year. The Big Ten isn't set up the way the SEC is. You don't necessarily usually get hey, we're going to play our non-conference rival in November. Now, USC has to play ball with that as well. But they're not playing. Now, this coming year, ACC, their little contract with them did them a favor because the Miami game is later. I think it's in November in South Bend. So Miami's going to have to go north. So that will help Notre Dame if they're trying to convince the committee next year. But to your point earlier, that's a tough thing for them, is to overcome the schedule and the fact that their best games are likely to be in the first few weeks.
Well, they've sort of boxed themselves into the fact that they, more often than not, are going to have to go 11-1 to get in the playoff. If last year was any indication, I mean, maybe 50% of the time they'll get in at 10-2, depending on what everybody else does. But they'll be so out of sight, out of mind without being able to play for a conference championship late in the season, I should say, that it will be difficult. And again, Brett sort of reminded me, I've been a fervent Notre Dame should join a conference guy, but Brett talked me a little bit off the ledge in terms of, there is some sort of old-fashioned romance about Notre Dame being a free agent and just kind of picking and choosing who they play, and it's its own special weekend when they come to town. But in the modern world, that romance is going to disintegrate when you get left out at 10-2, which,
Well, now
again,
look,
I think that's a possibility going forward.
if big if the Big Ten and the SEC end up making a 40-team Super League, all right, they're not going to have a choice. All right, but we're going to look at this. These years here will be looked back upon with your opinion is going to be favored big time, because it's going to be, how could they not have joined a conference? Because they just, there's less that they can control now. The Notre Dame argument is teams are going to play us. They want the home and home. They want the majesty. They want to meet us on maybe a neutral site and get the TV money. That's true. But now USC, who's their biggest rival, arguably, they don't need it, because they're going to play Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Wisconsin, and then add in Oregon and Washington, which they always already played. They're going to play their fair share of good games. So it's a matter of, what do you need? And plus, USC is going to get the TV money from the Big Ten that you don't maybe need that stuff. I hate seeing, I don't want to see that rivalry go away. It is going to go away, at least, temporarily. But I think what happens in the next 5 to 10 years, that'll determine how we look at this era of Notre Dame football, whether they were right to stay firm and being independent, or whether they should have just bit the bullet already.
Yeah, you're seeing how Notre Dame is modernizing. And so in their favor, we can count young, aggressive, first-time coach. Check. Well done. Marcus Freeman's a great hire for them. He has modernized their look. Their recruiting and their NIL has sort of been a modern notion of, hey, let's spend some money, let's get some talent. They've been selective in the portal, which I think is good for a blue blood. I don't think a blue blood has to go nuts in the portal. I think you have to be selective and smart. But I'm telling you, I think this not being in a conference is just going to be a weight on their back, because that is just being an old fuddy-duddy stuck in the mud about how, we don't have to join a conference. Well, you know what? You're forcing other teams like USC to drop you then, because USC's idea of modernizing is, I'm going into a conference that's better than my old conference. I don't have Cal and Washington State and Arizona, even their rival UCLA joined them, but that used to be their marquee game, but UCLA is not any good anymore.
Right.
So USC, I would almost defend them, being like, well, I'm sorry, Notre Dame, if you're in the Big Ten, we'd love to play you, but I just can't do it in this modern era anymore. And so Notre Dame, I'm telling you, man, I think it's a bad deal for them. And I think with each successive year, there'll be more pressure on their administration to cave.
All right. To recap what we've been talking about, and I'm going to say this, and I want you to either confirm or maybe tweak what I have to say. Ohio State has largely been capable, because of offensive personnel, of doing more, in our opinion, in these close games. They're capable of either not letting it be so tight to begin with, or even good on good. They're capable of being a little more aggressive offensively and getting the job done. And we would hold that against Ryan Day in those few times, probably 6 or 7 of the 12 losses, where you're not going to win every time. That we don't know for sure that Stetson Bennett doesn't lead Georgia back, even if Marvin Harrison doesn't get hurt. We understand that. You're not going to do it every time against great teams.
And real quick, in Oregon and Dan Lanning,
yeah,
had a wonderful day as a head coach. So maybe you just give credit where credit's due. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, the thing we didn't mention about the Georgia game, Ryan Day and his Mickey Mouse group of special teams coaches had a pump fake dialed up that would have worked, but yet Kirby Smart on the other sideline sniffed it out and called timeout. Dan Lanning, of course, you said he had that onside kick off Caleb Downs, and he even had I'm going to go ahead and
which
do
Ohio State was prepared for is why they had Caleb Downs up in the first
right.
wave. But again,
That's
sometimes breaks beat you.
So we believe that Ohio State's inability or unwillingness would be a better word to go ahead and be more aggressive offensively in those states of the game has hindered them in these games. What we would say, I think, about Notre Dame is it's been more of a personnel maybe issue on offense, or the fact that they lean in on defense being more important. And therefore, when you get in the tighter game, maybe you don't have the horses or maybe the scheme to really go right down the field. So I think that's where we are on the two coaches. They could probably tweak and improve quite a bit and could do better in these situations.
Yeah, in summation, they've both built incredible foundations, but if they're going to contend in the playoffs and win national titles, they have to overcome their own limitations, which I feel like are both in their minds.
Okay.
They have to listen to somebody else and have a different mindset, because we're starting to see results be very consistently bad.
All right. Yeah, well, we're solving the world problems here 1 week at a time on Catholics versus Buckeyes. We thank everybody for joining us. We appreciate the people that have checked us out so far. Please like, review, share, do all the things that will only help us get out there. We really appreciate the fact that Pick Six Previews, as Brett Ciancia came on with us. We're gonna cultivate that relationship, Brian, and that's going to be something going forward. We'll definitely hope to reach back with him when he brings the book out this year. Check him out on Twitter, Pick Six Previews. He's a great follow year round. And then again, please like, rate, review, tell your friends. We love to have more and more people join us as we break down Notre Dame and Ohio State football. Brian, thanks again for another great hang this week.
Thanks, Seth. It was a pleasure as always.
All right. So long, everybody.